Hello. So, I'm Peter Todd. I'm recently did a big blog post, article, whatever you want to go talk about it, on soft fork / covenant dependence layer 2s. That was funded basically by a company who was interested in investing in this space, so they wanted a sort of third-party reviewer, as me, to go kind of like look at all the stuff kind of coming out and figure out how does it all fit together. And with that, well, we really got to start with definitions, which is, what is an L2? I mean, what makes an L2 an L2? And if we're going to talk about L2s, well, obviously we're going to talk about L1s because the number is one less. And I would really call an L1 transacting with sort of passive security, which is sort of the security you get for a proof of work. And, Bitcoin itself, there's your first L1. Something like RGB, I would also call an L1. Now, if you haven't heard, RGB is basically a protocol that uses client-side validation to trade things on Bitcoin. I don't need to go into the details of it. The important thing about RGB with regard to this conversation is that RGB uses Bitcoin for the double spend prevention, and it uses it directly. There's no kind of incentives or anything. Open timestamps. My timestamp project is another example. Again, the data relevant to open timestamps ends up on the Bitcoin chain. And I'd say merge mining is kind of another example like this. I'm not going to say merge mining is secure, but the security model of merge mining is basically based on proof of work. And with all these systems, that is property that when you do something on these systems, when you transact, when you timestamp, whatever, if you walk away, what you did is just as secure, regardless of what you do. When you make a timestamp and open timestamps, you can go hide in a cave for 10 years, come back, and your timestamp's still valid. Now, with L2 systems, that's not true. Or at least, it usually isn't true. And what I would define an L2 as is something that works on top of the L1 in a way that tends to use at least a conglomeration of transactions and reactive security. Now, what do I mean by reactive security? Well, in Lightning famously, Lightning is based on punishment. You have a channel with a counterparty, you exchange a bunch of data, you exchange a bunch of Bitcoin transactions, and eventually one of these Bitcoin transactions might get mined. But if it's not the right one, you can punish your counterparty and put them into a state where they were worse off than if they did the honest thing and followed the protocol. But importantly, if you're not around to go punish them, they can get away with a bit of fraud. ARC has the same kind of property, and then you also get the weird one, which is unidirectional payment channels, CLTV payment channels. They're a little strange because in theory the incentives there are the counterparty always wants to go do the honest thing and mine the transaction that gives them the most. But, definitions are fuzzy, so we'll put payment channels in L2 no matter what type they are. Now, what does this really come down to for the user? Well, in L2, there's really two things you should be able to do. Either unilaterally withdraw your money or prevent the counterparty from benefiting from fraud. Now, certainly being able to get your money back, that's the preferred thing. But that isn't always possible. And a really good example of this is HTLCs. So, you may already know this, but HTLC stands for Hashed Time Lock Contract. And it is the basis by which Lightning works. When you go send money on Lightning, ultimately, it's an HTLC. But the issue with an HTLC is, well, what if I'm trying to send like 1 Satoshi? Now, if you have a Lightning wallet, if you try this, you certainly can send 1 Satoshi. And that 1 Satoshi is a real transaction. You really are sending 1 Satoshi. That's not some trusted thing. But the catch is, while an HTLC is in flight, there is no way to represent 1 Satoshi on-chain profitably. In fact, due to the dust limit, roughly speaking, you can't do it at all. But you certainly can't do it profitably, because to recover 1 Satoshi using on-chain data costs more than 1 Satoshi. However, Lightning uses a system where, while the HTLC is in flight and very small, that HTLC value is added to the channel value. So if your counterparty tries to steal that 1 Satoshi, they're going to spend more money in fees. Thus, they're not benefiting from fraud. But certainly if we had a magical way to, like, you know, negotiate 1 Satoshi payments, yeah, we do it. But there are technical limitations here. Now, what are not L2 systems? Well, liquid, cashew, state chains, I think are 3 examples. In fact, you know, state chains, I was actually asked by my clients to go and evaluate them as part of an L2 system. And when I looked into it, I think, well, you know, this isn't actually an L2. It doesn't fit our definition. Now, liquid, I think, is obvious why it's not an L2. Block streams, you know, group of functionaries, they're the ones who have the private keys of money. Liquid is basically a bank. Cashew, it's the same kind of thing. It's obviously a bank. State chains is maybe a little less obvious, and I'm not going to go into how it all works, but I think the interesting thing about it is if the counterparty was trying to commit fraud from the beginning, they can commit fraud. State chains uses some clever thing where, like, if they haven't done anything dishonest up to this point, they can't do something dishonest in the future. But we should have a strict definition of this. If dishonesty means they can take your money, well, it's not an L2. So, the next thing we want to go and have a sort of definition on is covenants. And the way we're defining covenants here is there are really restrictions on what transactions can spend in output. And restriction is more complex than just like a signature. Now, an interesting example of this, which already exists and a lot of people have recognized, is pre-signed transactions. And Lightning already uses this in how HTLCs work. Well, why is a pre-signed transaction a covenant? Because if you ignore the fact you could go sign a different transaction, which sometimes you can make impossible, it is a restriction on how you can spend a transaction. The only way to spend that transaction with a pre-signed transaction, if you ignore the other possible ways of signing, is by mining that one transaction. And that really gets to the heart of why Lightning uses this for HTLCs. Some cases in HTLCs, you need the output creating the HTLC to be only spendable in certain ways on chain. Check template verify. That's probably the most famous covenant lately. And basically it says, hey, the transaction that spends this output has to fit this restrictive template. You know, certain parts of it can be changed, but the inputs and the outputs, roughly speaking, have to match this exactly. I've heard some claims that SigHash any prevouts can be a covenant with really crazy abuses of ECC math. This seems to be common knowledge, yet when I tried to go and actually find the write-ups on how to do this, I couldn't quite find a good write-up, so I don't know. In my paper, I think I kind of wrote that off as, well, this isn't really clear how covenanted it is, but it seems to be kind of like that. Opcat certainly is, because you can create a covenant by using it, and I'll explain a bit more of that later. And as we'll find later in this talk, there's this whole variety of opcodes people come up, like opovict, you know, add a leaf to something, remove a leaf, whatever. And it's a very, very big range that people propose for certain use cases. And again, all these things are covenants because they restrict the spending transaction. They just, in this case, do it in a very complex way. So I'll give a bit of a detour before we get on more covenant and L2 system, which is mempool behavior is kind of a mess. And L2s need this stuff because in L2 systems, frequently you only have a limited time window which you have to respond to fraud from a counterparty. You know, unless you can get the transaction mined in a short enough time, you're screwed. And that's why things like transaction pinning and replacement cycling are problematic. And I'm not going to go into the full details there, but basically they prevent you from getting transactions mined or seeing transactions in the time window you have. You also get issues around fee payment, and fee payment turns out to be quite complex when you're trying to have covenants. Because again, the covenant says this transaction that spends this has to fit a certain way. Well, if you have a covenant, how exactly do you then pay fees on top of that? You know, if you have check template verify, how exactly do I add the input or the output or whatever necessary to pay a fee? It's not really clear. And a lot of the way we've kind of hand-waved this is say, well, we'll just use child pays for parent. We'll just spend an output of a transaction and that'll pay the fee or something. Well, sometimes that may be enough, sometimes it might not be. You can also use out-of-band fee payment, and I think these days mempool less space is the nicest example of that. You just pay a kind of extortionate price with Lightning, and you get your transaction mined. And that's cool, but it is very problematic from a miner centralization point of view, because if we start seeing miners getting a lot of business from this, well, if you're like some guy with, a mega hash or, well, whatever the numbers would be these days, mining in like your basement that happens to have a natural gas field next to it, you're not really able to benefit from out-of-band payments the way like Antpool can, because it's just so inconvenient for me to go pay you. And this creates situations where, well, maybe the guy mining on a small scale and try to run a small pool cannot earn as much money as bigger miners. So, overall, we don't want out-of-band fee payments to exist. We want to make them unlikely to be necessary, but they always will exist. You can't stop people from doing it. We also have my replace by fee rate proposal, which is related to transaction pinning, because a lot of it's like transaction pinning is really about an economic attack on miners. It's saying, hey, if we do this clever thing, you no longer have the transaction that should be profitable for you in your mempool and in your block templates, and instead some other transaction kind of blocks it. And replace by fee rate fixes certain economic situations where you would actually be better off as a miner by mining the higher fee rate transaction than a lower fee rate transaction with a higher fee. And an example I like to use this is, well, imagine you have a cattle auction, and I go rock up to the cattle auction, and I go say, you know what, I'm gonna go buy 10,000 cattle at $1 each. And if I do that in a cattle auction around here, I'm gonna get laughed at. But the way Bitcoin Core works is once I've made that bid, that terrible bid with a ridiculously low fee rate, ridiculously low, price per byte or price per cow, that's it, I'm stuck. I can't go up again and at this cattle auction say, well, you know what, I thought that was stupid. I'm gonna go buy one cow at $500 because 10,000 cows at one is $10,000. One cow at 500 is only $500. Now, one cow at 500 might be worth it for, might be a reasonable price, but Bitcoin Core will just reject that. Replace by free rate fixes this. But it has issues potentially around free rate related DOS attacks. How much data can you go put through mempools for a given amount of cost? And finally, the last thing I'll go mention, and fortunately we've kind of fixed this in the latest Bitcoin Core release, is we finally have stopped the dumbest transaction pinning attack of all time, which was the fact that we didn't always evaluate replacements. You used to be able to opt out of transaction replacement. And in practice, essentially 100% of the hash power has been mining with full RBF enabled, always evaluating transaction replacements for probably, 8-9 months now. It's been a very high percentage for a long time. And this actually comes out of ordinal adoption protocols, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, that's changed, so that at least out of this whole list we've actually kind of fixed. And if you upgrade to 28, that'll do some good. So, all right, enough of that detour. Why do we want better systems than Lightning? Lightning is pretty good, right? Well, the big one people like to go bring up is that Lightning needs, roughly speaking, 1 UTXO per end user. Well, how many UTXOs can you create per year if you allocate like 90% of block space to them? It's roughly 500 million. Well, I know. How many people in the world own cell phones? It's like 4 billion, roughly, maybe 5. It might be that Lightning is actually enough. Maybe this whole talk is useless, but it certainly is a potential problem. And you can definitely imagine, and in fact we've seen it happen, getting a UTXO can be expensive at times. And certainly if you have to pay like $10 for a transaction fee to create your UTXO, maybe your minimum lightning channel size is maybe like $100, maybe $1,000. Maybe that's where the kind of trade-offs lie. So if we can share UTXOs between multiple parties, then we can do a lot better. The other thing you get is issues around liquidity. And I wish I remember his name now. But anyway, there's recently a paper actually out on liquidity in Lightning networks and sort of what payments are actually feasible. And you can certainly have an issue where an easy example of this is if I have a Lightning channel and I periodically get paid a lot of money, potentially a lot of money is getting tied up just to enable infrequent high-value payments. We might want a better way than this and tying all this Bitcoin. Now, if you're a hodler, Lightning is actually kind of good for this because it pushes the Bitcoin price up. All this Bitcoin tied up in Lightning channels eventually could actually be a significant fraction of the total Bitcoin out there. Currently isn't, but in the future it could be, and that will push the price up. But if you're a business trying to make payments, that's not true. Then the final thing that Lightning isn't great at is interactivity requirements. A good example of this is, well, if I want to go pay you and you have a Lightning node on your phone, if your phone's off or out of reception, there isn't a good way in the Lightning Network protocol to actually make that payment happen. I can't even kind of give you an IOU that you can redeem later. And things like Cashew are nice for this, but Cashew isn't an L2, it's a trusted system. So, there are potential other L2s that'll fix this interactivity issue, or at least give different trade-offs. So, the next thing I did in this paper was actually review different L2 systems that don't currently exist. And one example of this is the terribly named L2. Terrible, terrible name, but yes, L Symmetry is the current name, but it still gets called as L2 in a lot of documentation. And this isn't really by itself an L2 that changes scaling. What L2 does, or what L Symmetry does, is it basically modifies interactivity requirements of Lightning by changing Lightning to be, rather than punishment-based, be sort of more of an updating system. What I mean by that is, if I have a L Symmetry channel with you, and you do something wrong, you put an invalid state or an obsolete state on chain, I can update that state by basically challenging you with a more recent one. Now, I'm not clear this is a good idea because punishment seems to discourage people from doing bad stuff.
It doesn't actually change the interactivity requirements because even if you were in the position before where you had time, now you're just updating state. It's the same amount of interactivity.
Sorry. Yeah, I might have misspoke there. It modifies interactivity requirements. And the key thing it does there is it means that from your point of view, you screwing up doesn't accidentally trigger penalties. You are correct to point that out. And arguably for your standard end user with a Lightning channel on a phone, maybe that's a good trade-off. Maybe avoiding them losing all their money due to some technical screw up is a good idea. But I'm not sure that removing the punishment actually works. Because you may be in a position where I can try to screw you over. The worst that'll happen is a bit of money will be spent on transaction fees. But if I succeed, I make a ton of money. So, in fairness, there are ways to run existing Lightning channels that some people use that have this kind of property. In certain situations, like with Lightning, there's this idea of a reserved amount. And if the reserve is 0, I could be in a situation where my counterparty has a state where they don't owe me, where I don't owe them anything at all. And they could try to use that state to go screw something over. But anyway, that's, long story short, is I think where L Symmetry is interesting is potentially it's a building block for more complex L2 systems. And example of this kind of thing is channel factories. The idea with a channel factory is this observation that out point in a Lightning channel doesn't actually need to exist on chain for the incentives of the channel to be correct. Now, a simple example of this is, well, imagine I have a channel open with you, but the transaction that creates the channel has not been mined yet. The question is, am I in a situation where I could screw you over by getting an invalid state mined if there is no way for me to double spend the previous transaction? And I'd say the answer is no, I can't screw you over, because you can always get the two transactions mined. You can get the transaction mined that creates the channel, and then you can get the transaction mined that does something with that channel output. And that's really what a channel factory is about. And if you can just kind of move things back one step, well, rather than having like me and you setting up a channel, I could have myself and every single other person in this room setting up a channel, but the transaction that creates those channels doesn't exist yet. And hypothetically, if we can all agree to create this, and then somehow do a bunch of business, and then do something else to close the channels, such as say a big multisig, then we're in a position where maybe we've saved a bunch of money on fees. Actually being in this situation would be kind of hard, but in theory, there's probably are use cases where this makes sense. Now, advanced channel factories is basically trying to make this work a little more often. And there are a lot of proposals for advanced channel factories. I'm not going to go through them all, but I think the gist of it, I can kind of say, the thing that they most have in common is they try to find ways to make it possible for people to add themselves and remove themselves from the pool of funds. And this is where like opcode proposals like opEvict come from. They're saying we could have an opcode that somehow takes away only one person's channel funds from the pool of funds that created 10 different channels at once. If we can do that, maybe we can make the business of figuring out how to negotiate all the state, how to, pick and choose what transaction to make. Maybe that could be easier. I think the big problem with the channel factories ideas is that A, the use case is kind of limited, but B, all these proposals for very specific opcodes, it's so difficult to get new opcode into Bitcoin. Are you really going to get like an opEvict in? Probably not. So the one that everyone seems to be excited about is ARC. And more likely than not, someone's going to present on ARC at this very conference. So I'm not going to go and go into a ton of detail about how ARC works. But I think the basics of it is kind of the same ideas as channel factories, in that you have a thing that doesn't exist yet that you can go trade. But with ARC, the focus is more on a virtual UTXO. So it's a UTXO that could exist if you mined the right transactions, but the incentives are such that you don't actually need to do that. And the really key concept with ARC that makes it feasible is, in ARC, you have rounds. And in those rounds, virtual UTXOs are created. But the important thing is the rounds end. And when they end, all the money goes back to the ARC service provider. And that means I can take my virtual UTXO and then sell it to get something, say, another virtual UTXO in a new round. And if I can sell it, eventually we can get to the point where even though one round might have, 10,000 virtual UTXOs created, maybe by the end of that round, they've all been sold, and now one transaction spending one output and creating one more new output, maybe that's enough to take that money from that round and do something with it again. And if you can arrange all this, great. You've got a massive scaling improvement. And because it's a virtual UTXO, you can do things like send someone a virtual UTXO, potentially offline, literally through something like email or something, and you've given them money. And there doesn't have to be any interactivity there. Now, the receiver has to have some interactivity in the sense that eventually the virtual UTXO is going to expire. But they don't, they have a time window when they can go do this. Now, probably the big issue with ARC, the hardest problem to go solve, at least with the original ARC protocol, is liquidity. And remember what I said about how virtual UTXOs expire? Well, this is a big problem because if I'm in ownership of a virtual UTXO and I want to continue owning it, I have to go buy another virtual UTXO by selling my current one. Well, the person on the other side of that trade, they have to provide a bunch of Bitcoin and then take future Bitcoin. And long story short, money costs money to have. You know, there's a time value of money, and whatever the interest rates are on that, that will essentially be a constant expenditure you need to maintain your virtual UTXO in a state where it genuinely is an L2, and you genuinely have trustlessness. Now, how much will this cost? Well, that's an economics problem. I mean, on my blog post, I give a potential calculation on this, but you know, what the market will look like for liquidity, that's really hard to predict, and I don't know we're going to find this out until people do it. Of course, the cool thing about ARC is because it is based on covenants like CTV, if you have a situation where everyone in the round can agree, you can actually run ARC in production right now using pre-signed transactions. You know, every single part of ARC that's a covenant, you can also implement, rather than with a opcode, with the people in the round just agreeing, hey, under this circumstance, you know, here's the transactions that would get mined, and that's valid, it can be mined, and you're going and so forth. It's a great example of how, you know, covenants in general, you can always simulate them with pre-signed transactions. And finally, the last L2 category I want to go talk about was rollups. And rollups is much more of an Ethereum world kind of thing. Interestingly, the people trying to propose it on Bitcoin, they always seem to be sort of Ethereum world people. But what it is basically is the idea that you can have sort of some kind of secondary blockchain, and then you could prove the validity of that secondary chain to then allow a transaction to happen on the Bitcoin main chain, or whatever main chain you've tied your rollup to. And I'm a little hesitant to really call these L2s because there are circumstances in rollups that suffer from what's called data availability problem. You know, if you don't have that data associated with this other chain, you may not be in a position where you can say, hey, this rollup should not have happened that way. Because if you can't do that, well, maybe someone can manipulate how the rollup rolls up and steal money. And the other big thing with rollups is the way they're being proposed to be implemented is with zero-knowledge proofs. Specifically, like things like, you know, ZK snark systems. Now, ZK snarks are very cool, but they are, you know, what kind of gets quote-unquote called moon math. They're very advanced mathematics. It's not really clear how all this stuff actually works. Implementations of it in practice, like as in Zcash, have had bugs that have led to things that could have killed the currency behind them. So, you know, one issue with rollups is like people propose things like an op ZKP that would directly evaluate a zero-knowledge proof, and we're probably not going to see that. We're probably going to see people implementing rollups with other opcodes. Very notably, people want to implement rollups with opcat and implement zero-knowledge proofs in general with opcat. And I couldn't tell you exactly how all this math works, but basically the guys who do say that they can use opcat to implement zero-knowledge proofs. All right, maybe they can, maybe they can't. But if you do allow this, well, an interesting thing is in rollups, basically anything's possible. Any rules are possible. You know, and this has been one of the arguments for them. Well, we can have any L2 we want. But as we've seen with things like ordinals and descriptions, maybe this isn't really what we want to get into. So, you know, it's an interesting space, but between the two of them, I think ARC seems a little more viable for Bitcoin and more likely to happen. Then the other thing I want to go talk about for L2s is what I was calling failure case scaling. Now, remember, the idea with all these L2s is that you can go scale by basically either collapsing the number of transactions that happen, or on top of that, collapsing the number of users. So, you know, Lightning by itself, it scales because you do so many transactions with very small number of on-chain transactions, roughly speaking like 1 or 2. depending on how you count it. Something like Arc can do scaling in both directions. A lot of transactions per users, and B, a lot of users with one UTXO, because all these UTXOs are shared. Channel factories, it's the same kind of idea. But in all these systems, what happens when it fails? What happens when your Arc service provider stops being an Arc service provider and goes offline? What happens when your counterparty in Lightning channel just stops responding? You have to go on chain. And the ratio of data between the good case and the bad case can get kind of scary. Even in Lightning, we've never seen a situation where a big Lightning service provider has failed in such a way that a ton of channels needed to be closed at once without any notification. Now, obviously, Lightning nodes have in fact gone offline, but they've never gone offline in a way that was uncooperative. We just do not know what this looks like. And a good example is, well, maybe not a great example because we're in the US, but Phoenix Wallet, which none of you guys can get in theory because of sanctions bullshit, but at least in the rest of the world, Phoenix is one of the better Lightning wallets out there. Well, Phoenix has a central point of failure, the company Async. They run the node, and while Async going down isn't a result of people losing their money, maybe they're not going to be able to close their channels fast enough to actually prevent fraud. Now, if you have something like Arc, the amount of data you need on chain versus in the bad case versus the good case is just that much more. So, I don't know, maybe we're kind of rushing into this stuff too soon. I would much rather see something like Arc deployed after we've seen something like, an LSP on the size of Phoenix just going down at once. But like it or not, Lightning LSPs currently are pretty reliable, so this may not happen in that order. So, the path forward. What covenant should we adopt? Well, I think one thing I'm going to say here is things like sort of the fancy tree manipulation, magic, covenants, they seem to kind of get ruled out because of politics. It's just too hard to come to agreement on what covenants to implement, especially when more niche use cases are involved. Do we really want to go all this effort to create an obscure type of channel factory that maybe 1,000 people will end up using? Heck, that was the complaint around Taproot by many people. Taproot wasn't used enough. Now, with Taproot, at least we'd say, yeah, obviously everyone's going to use it eventually, but certainly for a fancy opcode for a certain type of L2, maybe that's not true. Now, the other thing I'd go say is at the other end of that spectrum is maybe something like opcat is just too broad. I kind of brought this up in the previous slide. Opcat can kind of do anything. And there's issues around this. So it's kind of hard to say. And I'll also go point out, like, script revival, the idea of, sort of bringing back all of the opcodes Satoshi turned off, that kind of has the same problems as opcat. So, we may not see much consensus around actually making that happen. I'd say CTV, it's not perfect, and I believe there's going to be talk later this conference on CTV. But the thing with CTV is what it does is very simple. It just checks a template to a transaction. And that seems to be something that isn't very abusable. The biggest objection anyone's come up with CTV, other than Jeremy Rubin's crazy deployment plans, has been the fact that CTV doesn't play that well with paying fees, because there isn't an obvious way to add the fee input to a CTV using transaction. But, that may not be the end of the world. And you also get, like, Ccache any prev out, which arguably enables LN symmetry, although there's another proposal called L enhance for the same kind of argument. And, LN symmetry, maybe it's worth people adopting. I'm unconvinced that it's actually all that radical, all that different than Lightning channels, but people seem to like the idea. And then something else I kind of mention with L enhance is, this was an interesting one, I think, politically for me, because, of course, in my blog post on it, L-enhance was one of the proposals I kind of had to write off, saying, look, they just haven't actually done the work to argue for this proposal. The BIPs, when I read it, and I believe this is still true now, just didn't explain how does it actually work. I mean, what are the use cases? And I kind of got to say, in general, for all these proposals, like, you got to do the work. You got to figure out what things are going to use your system and write out use cases. Because otherwise, third-party reviewers, I mean, I'm not going to trawl through, 50 posts on, like, Bitcoin Talk or, Delving Bitcoin Now and other stuff to try to get an idea of what your thing is. This should be in the BIP. It should explain clearly, what does it do? Why is this good? What are the trade-offs? And L-enhance, at least when I was reviewing it, hadn't actually done that yet. Obviously, it'll do that in the future, but it's not there yet. And there's also a check sig from stack, and I'm going to have 3 slides in a second, kind of explain some more details. But it's, as you'll see in a second, it's a part of these solutions, not necessarily something by itself. And of course, like I mentioned earlier with the 4 billion cell phones figure, well, nothing at all is an option too. It might be that for now we actually are okay delaying L2s that scale even further for maybe another few more years. Maybe that's a reasonable option. Like, other than demand from things like ordinals, on-chain fees are not that high. And they're just, we're not bumping into block space limitations, opening Lightning channels. So maybe nothing at all is fine, but we'll see about that. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the ways that some of these things kind of differ from each other. And this is the kind of content that I had a hard time actually finding. So what's interesting about this sort of like pile of proposals is a lot of them kind of do the same thing in different ways. Like a check sig from stack as an example. It can emulate CTV, or it could argue the other way around, depending on what you want to say, because one thing can kind of do what the other does. And check sig from stack as an example, well, if you check the signature on the stack and check that it validates some data, you can reuse the same data with a check sig to effectively check that the same signature also validates the transaction. And this is kind of interesting. It kind of shows the low-level details you can play, but they do the same thing. And opcat, I mean, that's where opcat kind of comes in too. Like, what does opcat really have to do with covenants? Well, it's actually about letting you build up transaction data on your signatures, on your script stack, and validating that this thing you built up matches a transaction. That's what we're really doing under the hood. And funny enough, this is surprisingly not obvious, I found, to people. They kind of don't necessarily have a mental model of what's really going on. But that is what's really going on. And this is why opcat is so often tied to check sig from stack. Because you need both for it to be convenient. There are math tricks you can use with check sig where you very cleverly create a signature in such a way that it isn't actually validating what it should be validating to basically do what check sig from stack does. But, That's a pile of clever math tricks. Andrew Polstra would give a talk to you about that if you wanted. And also, there's an interesting interaction between like opcat and CTV, which is, well, if you're doing this trick of validating transactions by building them up, you can also use this with CTV to check that once you've done all that magic, it actually matches what the spending transaction is. So, there's synergy there. And certainly if we did do a CAT, maybe we'd also do a CTV. And finally, something else I want to point out with CAT that I think I seem to be the first person to really run into, which is that CAT isn't actually as expensive as you'd expect it to be. You would think a whole bunch of bytes would be used up building up things on a stack. But the trick is, script space has the witness discount. So if most of what you're doing is using CAT to validate the spending transaction, well, most of the bytes of the spending transaction in a typical use case are non-witness bytes, right? They're inputs and they're outputs. Well, the non-witness bytes, because they don't have the witness discount, are automatically like 4 times more expensive than the space you use to validate that in witness space. In long story short, it just means cat isn't actually that much more expensive. You're roughly spending like 25% more on fees to use opcat to validate an output. Now, obviously, that's more expensive than CTV, but it's not as bad as I expected when I first started analyzing this. And finally, the last point I want to make in general about L2s is that, all the kind of fancy versions of L2s, a way to think about them is they're like shared databases. So, what do I mean by that? Well, imagine you have a Lightning channel. You and I have a channel. Well, the state of that channel is something that we kind of have to communicate through each other. We collectively have some kind of state, and where the process of the protocol is about communicating changes that state back and forth, negotiating that. It seems kind of obvious. But if you have a much bigger L2, particularly things like rollups, well, the way you can think about the state of that L2 is it's kind of like a big database that's collectively shared. If it's functioning properly, we need to be in sync with all the states. Well, what is an L2 that goes to chain for something to happen? Well, that's really a forced change to the state. If I have a roll-up and I want to get my money out and other parties in the roll-up are not cooperating, I have to publish something to the chain to force the state of that roll-up to change. And this is an interesting concept because it says something about the scalability of these systems. In any of these systems, if we have a shared database, the only way to kind of deal with that shared database that makes any sense is things that kind of look like Merkle trees. This is crypto. It's got to have a Merkle tree in there somewhere. And if we have a shared state, well, it's going to have a Merkle tree of that shared state. Like in something like Arc, this actually comes about the shape of the transactions, the covenant transactions, that potentially can make UTXOs go on chain. They're actually a Merkle tree. You take one UTXO and you split it multiple times to eventually get a VUTXO. Well, publishing that on chain is really changing the state of that shared database. And if you have something fancy like a rollup, well, an interesting question here is scalability. How much can this scale? I would argue, I think the best you can do is roughly a log 2. For the size of your shared state, because it's going to be publishing some extract of that. It's going to be a Merkle tree. Thus, your failure cases are going to be roughly a Merkle tree of data going on there. And it's also why things like Arc potentially can scale much better in certain failure cases, because in that case, as you put stuff on chain, you can just put the whole tree on chain rather than repeatedly getting sort of extracts. Like, remember when I was talking about channel factories? Well, imagine you have a channel factory where there's some log2 process which will allow one person to exit after another. That adds up if a bunch of people need to exit at once. Whereas like something like Arc, where they just sort of put stuff out of trees, well, remember, what's the size of a tree, like a binary tree? Well, it's just double the lowest number of elements. So it's an interesting point. I haven't seen it discussed much. But I'm told I only have 5 minutes, and I wanted to give some time for questions, so any questions?
Your statement about Arc being perhaps superior to other forms of like on-chain ejection hinges on this idea that the failure case is either total or like there's no failure. There's no, in the case where you have partial ejection, you won't necessarily have like a situation where all of the people who are in this shared UTXO are having to eject all at once.
I may have misheard you, but I think I think the way I can respond to that is say, certainly in Arc you can have partial withdrawal from the tree. I mean, some people can choose to exit and other people don't have to. Now, there are different ways to implement ARC, but you can certainly make it that is the case. Maybe that's what you're trying to say.
Right. The main thing that I'm trying to challenge here is this idea that you were saying that ARC might be more efficient just because you can just slap the entire Merkle tree on chain, and then the other ones might have like additional chain footprint as a result of like having to do these partial ejections.
Yeah. Well, the main difference there is certain like roll-up proposals I've seen, because it is this very complex state. The proposal is not to implement a way to really like get the state out incrementally. Maybe a more clear example of this is, well, you certainly imagine in an advanced channel factory situation, if you just don't have a way to go and split off the balance of one person, other than splitting off the balance of one person with like a descent down a Merkle tree, if everyone needs to exit, you may have to repeatedly descend down a Merkle tree over and over again, which is much bigger than something that looks more like a tree itself.
Right, but even in that explanation that you just gave, it hinges on the assumption that everyone needs to exit. But a lot of the designs of these things are really predicated around the assumption that giving anyone the option to exit will generally result in no one needing to exit. And so the any as opposed to every...
Well, I mean, the issue there is like mass exit is always a possibility. You know, you always can be in a situation where everyone just has to exit. You're not always able to... great example is something like ARC. If the ASP goes down, there is no alternative other than mass exit. And a lot of these systems just have third parties that hinge on this, and there isn't necessarily a way to do something incrementally.
If we are starting with the assumption where mass exodus is always a possibility, then I think all of these systems fall apart. Because the very compression on which we're relying in order to scale may fall apart at any moment. So I don't think...
Well, I mean, I brought that up earlier, mass exit for any of these, or even partial exit for any of these systems, depending on how far you push scaling, might be enough that fees spike and then you're fucked. So, I think the more interesting thing there is to say you want systems where the data failure rates ratio is as good as possible. And things that are tree-based, like ARC, where revealing part of the tree means further people have to reveal less, definitely has an advantage there. Another question?
Okay, so my question is this, is that you mentioned that OPCAT might be too powerful and you might have concern about that. In your previous article, you mentioned that NEV is one of them. Is it the only one, or you have other concern about OPCAT?
I mean, I think that's the biggest concern about OPCAT. Frankly, a concern I had before I'd actually looked into the details was that OPCAT was, sounded like was so inefficient in terms of block space. But, as I looked into it more, I realized that isn't actually true because of this witness discount. But I'd say the big remaining concern is definitely, it's so hard to know what people are going to build with this. And like it or not, I mean, Bitcoin is useful for certain things more than others. And while there's limits to what we can stop on Bitcoin, as a good example being, I think Ocean's efforts at stopping inscription is just stupid. It's not going to work. But adding new opcodes that enable all this kind of interesting stuff, we don't necessarily want to rush into that. And I would be inclined to kind of put the brakes on that a bit and do something simpler first. And again, a lot of this comes down to this notion of data failure ratio. We just don't have the experience to know what Bitcoin's really capable of. We're much better off with a system that's smaller and actually works than a system that grows really large and then fails in terrible ways.
I agree, because if we have OPCAT, a lot of the things that we will see today, for example, Lightning would be not relevant if you have OPCAT, right? Because a lot of the problem, a lot of the limitation that Lightning is facing right now, you solve all of them with OPCAT.
Well, I mean, I guess the big thing to say there is viable L2s that give you a lot of benefits are already possible with CTV. So I'd be inclined to try CTV first and then see how that goes. I wouldn't want to rush into making Bitcoin general purpose immediately.
Got it.
If you had a choice between 3 more years of indecision or picking OpCat or OpCTV, which would you choose?
Oh, definitely CTV. Like, CTV is the simpler thing that's less likely to blow up in our faces.
So, I think the counter argument to let's slow down and let's figure out what the optimal thing to do is for some unknown set of customers is that we could take a principle where we can. Sorry, the delay is killing me.
We could take a principle where we can step changes Bitcoin that are experimental, and as long as they're getting maintain the code, then as long as the miners are going to mine the algorithms, that would give you more experiments.
I mean, yeah, the big issue there is like Bitcoin's over $1 trillion asset right now, and they're, you don't necessarily get to put the genie back in the bottle, and you don't necessarily get a second chance. If we go do something to Bitcoin that actually screws it up to the point where it doesn't work properly, we can't create Bitcoin 2.0. Our chance is probably that, and we're done for. So, again, I think we're much better off growing Bitcoin slowly enough that we don't screw up. And the other argument, again, I'd make as well, there's probably only 4 billion, roughly, cell phones in the world, maybe 6, maybe 7. Like, we're just not in a position where if Bitcoin is used for financial transactions, that there's that much, that much demand on block space. Now, if you're using Bitcoin for a whole lot of other stuff that isn't strictly like moving Bitcoin around, things like inscriptions, whatnot, yeah, there obviously is a ton of demand for block space. But for what people seem to think Bitcoin's goal is, I think the amount of block space we have right now looks reasonably close to what we need. And, that might be enough. Now, a lot of people want to go create all these complex systems on top of Bitcoin. I think the sort of people really pushing like OpCat-based rollups, they want to create all kinds of financial systems. But, we don't necessarily want to say yes to that. It isn't necessarily good for Bitcoin.
Yeah, question about your comment about rollups suffering from data availability. Do you see any viable solutions to that problem?
Well, I mean, an issue there is one viable solution is you stick the data onto the Bitcoin chain. And there are some rollup designs where that is actually all that's done. I mean, all the data winds up on the chain. And at the extreme, some of those solutions look just like colored coins or whatever, which obviously do work. But the question is, like, what's sort of in between? And something I found in my research was fully fleshed out roll-up designs that the proposals just don't exist. Like, nobody that at least I could find has a fully fleshed out roll-up proposed for Bitcoin that actually has a paper or code that actually makes sense enough to go say how it actually works. An example of this was like the Enigma. Again, I was asked by the client to go evaluate Enigma, and I tried to evaluate it, and like all I could find is like write-ups that were really more marketing than actual tech detail. Maybe Enigma works, maybe it doesn't, but until someone actually shows me the documentation explaining how it really works under the hood, I can't answer that question.
Do you see that as a technical limitation, or that just hasn't been attempted yet?
I don't know, because like no one's convinced me it works. Like I can kind of imagine things on my own that maybe could go work, but in my role as writing the Cell 2 paper, that wasn't my role to go talk about my own ideas. It was my role to go evaluate other people's ideas, and they just hadn't done the work to explain what the heck were their roll-up proposals exactly. And certainly things like this exist on Ethereum, but frankly, I didn't bother doing the effort to really track down Ethereum ideas because I know so many of them are actually bogus under the hood. There's so many things on Ethereum that claim to be smart contracts, yet they have, 3 of 3 multi-sigs that can just do anything. And once you have that kind of thing, I mean, is it really worth, going into detail of a system that's never actually been implemented fully. Like Lightning clearly works reasonably well in adversarial situations because people put millions of dollars on it between parties that don't trust each other. But in the Ethereum world, a lot less of that has actually happened because so many of these systems just have all these back doors and rely on trust ultimately.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Okay, we're a little bit over. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, real quick, I want to say something. Peter has come all the way from the socialist Canada country to come here to the great state of Georgia. Might not be a socialist state, we'll see. But, it means a lot. Peter got booked a flight to Lugano. He's one of the few people that made the trip to come all the way to here. I just really, another round of applause for Peter doing all that. Okay. Oh, okay, wait. Sorry, Peter, I know I congratulate you, sir. You've been accused of unlicensed RBF and promoting unsanctioned wallets here. Sir, I'm gonna have to ask you. You might know, Satoshi is being imprisoned,